Welcome to week 2 of International Human Rights. This week we look at human rights documents and what's the difference between a covenant and a declaration. Last week we looked at the assessment criteria, including the structure of the essay. We also had a brief look at the structure of the United Nations, including looking at the role of the General Assembly and the Security Council of the United Nations. If you missed last week, there is a lecture on the Moodle and also on the YouTube page. Okay, so this week we will be looking at the various human rights documents that have been published by the United Nations. We will also be looking at what is the difference between a covenant and a declaration. In particular, we will be looking at what they call the International Bill of Rights, but we will also discuss some other treaties and covenants from the UN. And I'll briefly mention the Convention on the Elimination of all Forms of Discrimination against Women, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the Convention Against Torture, and the Convention on the Elimination of all Forms of Racial Discrimination. Looking at human rights documents is relevant to your course because in your essay, paragraph 2 relates the issue you have chosen to discuss to a particular human rights document. So this week's lesson helps you with that part of your essay. So the International Bill of Rights consists of 3 documents. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which we have already spoken about last term, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. Okay, so let's start with talking about what the difference is between a declaration and a covenant. A declaration, such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, is an ideal or an aspiration. Okay, it's something we really want, but it is not legally binding on the countries that sign it. A covenant is a legally binding document that a country signs. It means when you sign a covenant, you are making a commitment to incorporate the rights in that covenant into the legislation of your country. Now, when a country signs a covenant, they are making a commitment, but they can also register reservation to certain articles in the covenant. So, for example, the United States usually registers a reservation to any article against the death penalty, for example. And many other countries have signed covenants and made commitments to follow the covenants with certain reservations, and Australia does that as well. So last term we spoke at length about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And if you recall, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was put together in 1948 and was a reaction to what happened during World War II. And we did discuss quite at length, if you recall, the moral force of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So it's a declaration. It doesn't have a legally binding effect on the countries that signed it, but it has a moral obligation. So the argument for having the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is that many countries, most countries around the world have signed it. And these are the ideals that these countries have agreed to, that these are what we believe are universal human rights. Now, the United Nations decided in 1966 that having a declaration was great, but what they really needed to do is to be able to put these rights into a framework that would have some sort of legally binding commitment on countries that signed it. So they came up with 2 documents, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, ICCPR, was published in 1966, so it was during the Civil Rights Movement. It includes rights such as the right to freedom of conscience, the right to a fair trial, and the right to be free from slavery. There is a summary of the ICCPR on page 22 in your book. And if you read about human rights, a lot of people will refer to the ICCPR when discussing human rights. So Australia signed the ICCPR in 1980, so it took us quite a while to sign it. Most of the rights in the ICCPR are not absolute. And in the document, it says that the rights can be subject to reasonable limitations. And some of those limitations can be to protect national security, to protect public order, to protect the general welfare of a democratic society. Now, if you think about what we've been undergoing with the coronavirus and how some of our rights have been taken from us, these are the reasons why, even though we have signed a legal commitment to preserve these rights, this is a legal way that the rights can be limited in order to protect the public good. However, there are some rights in the ICCPR that are absolute, and two of those are freedom from slavery and freedom from torture. And according to the UN, there is no reason ever to infringe upon these rights. So these are absolute rights. When you think of situations such as Guantanamo Bay, you can see that in that case, where prisoners were subject to torture, that the United States have infringed upon an absolute human right under the definition of the United Nations. The third document that makes up the International Bill of Rights is the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, which was also published in 1966. This includes the right to work, the right to education, and the right to strike. There's a copy of that in your book on page 20. Now, as far as the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights is concerned, Australia signed it in 1975. But in regards to this covenant, states must demonstrate that they are taking steps in good faith to achieve the rights to the best of their capabilities. And this part of the document recognises the fact that wealthier nations are more able to preserve these rights than poorer nations. So there are limits in this document as well. So the United Nations have supplemented the International Bill of Rights with many other conventions, including the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and the Convention Against Torture. And if you look at the dates of when some of these conventions came out, you can relate that back to events that were occurring in wider society during that period. And through looking at those events, you can see how the UN either reacts or doesn't react to social movements. So your task this week is to research one of the human rights documents, find a simplified or full version of it, summarise its contents in a short paragraph, and find out which countries have signed it. And I'm taking this from page 28 in your book. Now, it would be a good idea, as this task relates directly to your essay, if you have decided what topic you are going to talk about in your essay, you can select the document that will be relevant for your essay and for your issue. So that's all for this week, and thank you very much for listening to the lecture. I hope you enjoyed it, and keep safe. See you next week.